Welcome to another breaking news edition of Authors Reads. The reason why it's breaking news, my good friend Dave Bueche has just written a book called Tales from Hippie Cove. And here to talk about it is my good friend Dave Bueche.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Just so we get this out of the way, could you spell your name for those listeners who are perched listening?
Right. Ready to credit card number, PayPal. They're like, just give me the details so I can buy this thing. The last name is spelled Bueche. Hey, real quick, just a
Okay.
little side. My name has
Mm-hmm.
a strange pronunciation. It's pronounced Bueche.
Mm-hmm.
But if you read it and if you know any German, it's like Buka, which is butcher, probably is the derivation of it. And it was always pronounced that way. And then my uncle was in World War II and he was in basic training in Mobile, Alabama. And the drill instructor zeroed in on the German sounding name and he kept using him as the foil. And he'd say, well, maybe Mr. Buka can explain why we have to go to Europe and fight with the Germans. And he kept like calling him out. So my uncle called back to Chicago and he said, we're going to say Boucher from now on. Just change the way we say it. So it got switched in like 1943 or 1944, kind of based on World War II.
On this side of the Atlantic at the start of World War II.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
If you had been on the other side, it probably would have stayed the original pronunciation.
Yeah, and I think there's people, I think I have a bunch, probably relatives that everyone, I used to travel to Austria a lot, and they would say, that's very strange the way you pronounced your name. And then I learned that story. So anyway, it has nothing to do with the book, but
So, Dave, tell me
right.
how your life journey has resulted in you writing a book at this stage in your life.
Okay. I started writing this book quite a while ago, actually. The book is based on a trip that I took to Alaska in 1987, so quite a while ago. Then I started writing the book, I think, in 2003. And I think it all gets a little hazy, but I think I probably had a finished draft in 2005. I got married. I was kind of a late bloomer, so I got married when I was 42 in 2007. We had a kid right afterwards. So in like within 18 months, married, had a kid, bought a house, and had it sort of like still have a full-time corporate job that keeps me pretty busy. So the manuscript I'd created in those 2 years before I got married got put on the shelf, sat there for a long time. My son's now a preteen, and not that that isn't still a good amount of work, but I have the space in the last couple of years to come back to it. So I came back and started working it, and here we are after a lot of editing and twists and turns all these years later.
Why write a book at this point rather than, say, buy a convertible and see how fast you can get through Malibu?
Um, I don't know. I guess I always sort of saw myself as a writer, in my mind. So I mean, that's part of it. I think you have to kind of see yourself as like, yeah, I can do this. I'm a big reader, so I remember Stephen King wrote a book, Stephen King on Writing, which I think is an excellent book. If you're an aspiring author or just an author that's out there, like he gives a lot of real solid rules. But one of the things he says is writers read. I think that's really true. Like if you're writing, and it's probably true for nonfiction too. But if you're writing fiction, just like playing music, right? Like you end up, that becomes your vocabulary, different people you've read, and you're kind of synthesizing those voices and ways of telling stories. So I think I had a pretty good literary template in my head, and I think I had this idea that sometime or another I'd be a writer, and then I also had this sort of big life experience that had a beginning, a middle, and an end that felt like it kind of lent itself to a novel length enterprise.
What genres of fiction do you like to read?
I guess it would be contemporary fiction or political fiction. I don't know what you'd call Stephen King. I tend to go by authors. I'll find an author I like and then I'll read their whole catalog and find another one. But I mean, I'm not into real exotic, or from my mind, real exotic vampire fiction, or, there's so many subgenres. I mean, that was an interesting thing of with trying to market this, is just when you look at someone asking you the question, like, what genre of fiction are you? And you look at the drop down menu of all the choices you can make, it's huge. I mean, it's a whole world out there.
Well, yours is a travel narrative, right?
Yeah, this one is, although I've written other stuff. So one of the ways that I kind of built up, because writing a novel is your first thing, I think can be a little daunting mentally. So one of the things I did to kind of build it up was work with short stories. And I mean, that was a great way for me on a few levels, because if you're thinking I just am writing something that's 10 pages long, you're a lot less likely to vapor lock on that. Like, that's less anxiety. And then it also allows you to play around with things like, so I said I was a big Stephen King fan. Like, I wrote a short story that is sort of a supernatural short story. Or, write something in the first person, then try writing something in the third, or write something that's a period piece. So you can kind of do that and play around with things and build up your muscles and your confidence. So I had done that. So this one, I guess you could call it a travel one. I've written other stuff that I wouldn't put into that category.
I know we've spoken before, and you mentioned that you've had some help from people along the way. Would you like to say thank you to some of those people?
Yeah, so Jess Winifeld, who is a writer who's written, he has a book, an excellent book called My Name is Will. It's out in print that I would recommend. And, he's just done lots of writing for magazines, and he's written for TV and movies. And he's just been writing for a long time. He was also one of the original performers and writers of the abridged works of William Shakespeare, which is kind of a cultural phenomenon that's all over the world now, like a franchise. He gave me, like, and we didn't meet that many times, but I feel like everything he told me was really high value, and probably like real common things that I was just sort of late in the game to learning. Such as, I mean, one of the things is just the statement. He said, you have to be willing to kill your children. Have you heard that one before, Dan?
Please tell me why you should kill your children.
Right. And then he handed me a 45 semi-automatic revolver and
And a
kind of not,
bottle of vodka, I believe, was
yeah,
involved. Yeah, yeah.
pointed me towards a Harley Davidson and left the room. No, that's the idea that, so when I wrote this, the original draft was, I think, like at its biggest point was 122,000 words. And so, I mean, this is just basic stuff that anyone could tell you, but I didn't know because I didn't know, I was just sort of starting out. He told me, he said, look, 80,000 words is kind of what people are looking for. He said, and maybe if you were Stephen King, you can bring in 122 and they'll say, yes, sir, Mr. King, and quibble over a few minor points and publish it. But he said, that's really big. Like, no one's even going to look at that. So then I got into editing, and there would be parts that I would feel like, God, I love this. Like, I had a whole first chapter part where the main character, Dave, gets lost on a pot farm, and these young kind of humorous pot farmers catch him in a rope snare, and they think he's a federal agent in disguise. So they give him this whole quiz where they make him name members of the Grateful Dead. They're like poking him with a broom, and you can't remember the second drummer of the Dead, and then finally I'm like, Bill Kreutzmann, they let him out of the snare. So it was really fun. Like, I really liked it, but it was almost like just a short story that was dropped into the novel. It wasn't pulling you forward. It was just like a really fun little detour. So that was a child that had to be killed. That's what it means. It's like, you love this thing, you created it, you think it's good, but it doesn't serve the arc of the story. It's slowing things down. So you just have to just be ruthless and say, sorry, little child. I went from 122,000 words down to, I think, 78,000. So, I mean, I cut a lot of material out. It's almost easier to cut big, like, okay, let's cut this whole section out, than to find, you know what I mean, that many little pieces here and there. So I cut out, big chunks, some of which I thought were pretty good. And maybe there's another life for them, but Some of them, it's like, nah, like maybe you live and die in my document folder on my computer and you never get seen. That was, you got to be willing to kill your children. And that was a good piece of advice. You just have to be ruthless and say, does it help the story? And if it doesn't, you have to just snip it out.
Was there other advice or other advisors?
Another thing Jeff said, I remember sort of the first time I'd given him a copy of the manuscript, and he was a great guy also, and that he read my 122,000 page manuscript. I mean, that's a big labor of love there. Or he read it enough. I mean, he probably kind of speed read it, but he read it enough that he knew the story. We went out to lunch and he said, in one or two sentences, hit me with what's your story about? And I was like, well, it's about a lot of things. It kind of just started pivoting and rambling or whatever. And he said, okay, he said, that's a problem. You know, like you need to be able to kind of, when someone asks that question, and that almost ends up being kind of your blurb on your book, you know, you need to be able to break it down into, here, can I read you the blurb?
Yes, you may.
So this is what I ended up with. An impulsive trip to Alaska morphs from a colorful summer job into a series of tests and challenges for Dave, a 22-year-old LA native on the brink of adulthood. So right there, that could be my two sentences, right?
Right.
And then I went on with one more paragraph. This is just the back of the book. Dreams of high-paying work on a fishing boat soon dashed. Dave and friends find themselves working in a salmon cannery and sharing a cabin in a squatter village in the woods outside town. Navigating this new world, his path crosses Charles Manson devotees, a rich dropout attempting to recreate the Stone Age, a beautiful, elusive co-worker, and her insanely jealous stalker. As the stakes rise, he'll find out if he has what it takes to prevail in a world of frontier justice, where laughter, love, and all the points between are as immediate as the beauty of coastal Alaska. I couldn't have done that when he first hit me with that. So I think that's a pretty basic thing, just to be able to break your book into a little paragraph or two. Like, you know, it's funny. I was talking to a friend about the editing process, and you work so long with something, you kind of lose. It's very hard to have perspective about, is this any good or is this, you know what I mean? Like, especially
Right.
after you've figured out the obvious bad parts and you kind of got a more serviceable piece. And there's a scene, just a little tiny aside that, like, you know, you can always go back and keep picking at it. You know, there's always another edit you could do. But I have a scene where they're talking about the Alcan Highway in here, and they're driving, which is the Alaska Canadian Highway, which is pretty epic. It goes through the Yukon and these real desolate areas. Where one of the characters in the conversation reveals that it was actually built by African Americans who were sort of shipped up there during World War II in case the Japanese attacked Alaska. And they wanted to have a road that they could get armaments. They built it, which is a really interesting little fact. I just kind of learned that, you know. And I have a character kind of relate that in dialogue. And I think it's fine. Like I left it in the book. It's a very short little just passing moment. It was almost like the character was like a little mini Wikipedia page for a minute. Like, you know what I mean? Releasing this interesting fact that I wanted to kind of just get out there because I thought it was interesting. I think that's the kind of thing that matters, is like, you know, if I were to go back and edit that out, I would edit it out because it's like, it's not consistent for that character, maybe.
Right.
You kind of feel the hand of the author reaching in a little bit and, you know, educating the audience, and it pulls you out of the reality of, would a 22-year-old college kid really know this or talk about, you know, whatever. I think that's where you have to focus. It's not details in the real world, it's details in the reality of the world you've created and the characters, so that it's consistent and believable, hopefully, the whole way through.
Do you want to talk about the other guys on the trip, and have they read the book?
Yeah, they read the big bloated version that I did back in 2005, and I like went to Kinko's and printed it and had them slap a cover on it. They read that and they liked it at the time. You know, it was a long time ago. I think one of them was a little put off, you know, or was a little like, is that really what I'm like? And I'm like, well, no, this is like a highly fictionalized, you know, and then you kind of exaggerate certain characteristics, but all that being said, now with the passage of time, the two of the main characters, who are Dave Royal and Sean Culhane, still good friends of mine, real dear friends that I've known for 30 or 40 years. They're both really excited about it and they love it. And, I think they get a kick out of the fact that they're memorialized in a piece of fiction. And that someone, it was sort of this, when you're 22, you just do stuff like, yeah, okay, that sounds good. Like you don't, like as an adult now, as an older person, you're always very thoughtfully weighing pros and cons, but you just jump into things. You don't have any responsibilities.
Right.
So I think the trip ended up for all of us being more epic than maybe we thought it would be. In hindsight, it's like you look back and it's like, wow, like that was a pretty crazy thing that we did. Like we didn't even have jobs lined up. We drove up the entire coast of North America. Like there's a line in the book, the bigger book that got edited out, but that I thought was an interesting line. If we had driven from Los Angeles to New York, we would have come to the end of the East Coast and gone 800 miles further into the Atlantic. Like that was the length that we drove up the West Coast. So just even the drive, I think we had no idea what we were getting into. And at some point, we're like, okay, we'll sleep in shifts and there'll always be someone driving. And we came up with these rules. Okay, someone has to be awake with the driver, which is a really good rule. And then it was a camper van, so we also had beer in the back. We'd be like, the guys in the back who aren't driving can drink, but the driver can't drink. And then there was a whole debate about can the co-pilot drink? And we're like, no, the driver can't drink, the co-pilot can't drink. So I think they like hopefully having it in the book just because it sort of memorializes this event that we all did that was, I don't know, kind of a cool thing to do in our early 20s.
What I like about that little story is it reminds me of that being a time in your life when you could reasonably have discussions about how close can you drink to the guy who's driving, and having these almost Talmudic discussions about at which point does temptation stop or does temptation start for the driver as you're driving just hour after hour after hour. When looking back in hindsight, there's a very sensible solution to the whole problem.
Why don't you just all say sober for the driving part of the trip? It's like, no, that's ridiculous. We'll work out a reasonable compromise here. Right, right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense too, like what you're talking about. I think, like with our discussion about, drinking rules on the trip, and even at that young age, we were sort of aware of like everything was always a little bit of a joke. You know what I mean? Like the irony of like, well, no, I have a counterpoint to that. Let's have a reasonable debate about this. They're very funny guys. I'll say that about Sean and Dave, and I think yourself, Dan, and a lot of the people. We've known each other a long time. We used to hang around with. I think we're very funny people. When you kind of got them together, they had everybody sort of built on everybody else's jokes.
Which is an important skill if you're cooped up in a VW van. Was it a VW?
Yeah, it was. We got one of the things early on was we rolled up to the US Canadian border. It's like VW van for 20 something, pull over right here. Like we're going to be inspecting your van. And we had some pot in the van. So we almost got the whole thing almost got kind of like turned around at the Canadian border. But one of the guys, Dave Royal, who in the book his character is titled Royal because my name is Dave as well, and we called him Royal a lot by his last name. Royal was also bringing this weird incense that he'd gotten from the Renaissance fair that we used to act at sometimes, and it was this powdered brown incense that looked exactly like heroin. So he brought that. So he worked really hard to hide the pot and then just left the heroin incense, because it's just incense. So at some point we're on the side of the road and we see the border guards holding up this baggie and pointing at it and nodding. And I'm like, what is that? And he's like, it's just the incense that you've seen it from the Renaissance fair. And I'm like, I mean, number one, like of all the things you could bring, you brought powdered you know what I mean? Like, okay, boy, good thing we got that for the trip. But to not recognize that, right? But they did a test on it. They took it into a room and did a little test, and we kept saying it's not heroin, it's incense. And they're like, "Why would you bring incense?" They were saying the same things I was saying. So anyway, they did the test on it, and it wasn't incense, and they ground the pot up under their boot and broke the bong and just said, just move through Canada as quickly as possible. Do you have any money? And we're like, we've got a couple $100. They're like, just get the hell out of here. I think they were disgusted with us, which, and this doesn't make it into the story, but they said, move as quickly as possible. And we drove about 30 miles and the sun was setting and there was a little roadhouse. We're like, let's just get a beer. And pulled over. That was another stupid move, but anyway, we made it through Canada nonetheless.
Um, well, this has been fun. Do you have a
Yeah.
selection of your book you would like to read to entice people to buy it?
Yeah, yeah. So if I could set this up quickly, we've made it up to Alaska. We're living in a squatter kind of a village, like outside of town. And what this is basically is these shacks that are very minimal. They keep the rain out. They're just kind of like a frame with like a blue tarp on the roof. And if you show up, you get the shack, right? So we've met some people. We met a guy named Patrick and a German guy named Karsten who were up there that just lived there, and they're like our age, and they're friendly. So we're over at Patrick's house, and so we've met Patrick and Karsten. There's these two twins, Eric and Arthur, and we're all there anyway, hanging out in this Patrick's shack. They're all sharing it. We go over there. They have a little party. It's like our first night, and begin drinking. It's raining like crazy. And the guys, Sean and Dave, decide they're going to give each other haircuts, which is just not a great plan in general to have people who aren't professionals cut your hair, just as a general rule. But by candlelight when you're drunk and non-professional, even worse. So we come up on the place where Sean is now going to cut Royal's hair and jump in here. I got up and moved directly across from them on the other side of the table. Things had progressed while I'd been receiving my education on Alaskan wildlife. Sean was just finishing up. I looked at Royal straight on and from the side, and all things considered, he didn't look too bad. His hair was noticeably shorter, with sort of a step on the back, but for someone who didn't cut hair, Sean had done a respectable job. I was sitting next to Karsten, who was offering cryptic comments like, "You have received a horse. Be careful where you look." I tried to correct him using his name in the sentence and ran into one of those long-standing conversational staples, the correct pronunciation of his name. "Karsten, do you mean don't look a gift horse in the mouth?" I asked. "My name is not Karsten, it's Karsten," he replied, saying his name exactly the same each time. "Karsten," I said. "No, Karsten," he barked in maximum frustration, still exactly the same. Sean and Royal both rolled their eyes, indicating they'd been down this road themselves. I changed the subject. "So, sort of a commando look for Royal. What's the plan for Sean? Maybe a David Cassidy meets Iggy Pop? Or how about like a manly Princess Di? All the glory and majesty, but with some smoldering manpower burning below." "This is good stuff. I'm listening. Keep it coming," said Royal, as he got up and switched places. "We discussed this," said Sean, with as much concern as anyone in his state could muster. "Stick to what I told you." "Yes, sir," said Royal, whispering aside. He gets a little bitchy this time of the month. "I'm serious," said Sean. "No, I got it. Don't worry," he replied. Well, as soon as he started, one of two things became clear. He had totally disregarded Sean's conservative directives on his haircut, or was trying to honor Sean's wishes, but his radical intoxication and or incompetence made this impossible. From my side of the table, I saw Royal's maniacal grin, the glint of scissor blades in candlelight, and huge chunks of hair falling to the floor. Sean saw it too. "What the fuck are you doing?" he yelled, pulling away. "Giving you a haircut," replied Royal, not missing a beat. "What I talked about was like a trim. You just cut 5 inches off of my hair." "Well, I thought that's what you wanted. Sorry, come on back. I got to even it out." "Even it out? Are you fucking nuts?" Sean was out of the chair, standing, facing Royal. His long, formerly attractive blonde hair was missing a piece, like a shingle fallen off a roof, on the right side, a few inches back from his eyebrow. One of the twins, Arthur, I think, still holding his styling candle, said, "I think he's right. You've got to even it out." Sean reached up and felt his hair, his hand sliding along until it came to the discontinuity. to a big empty lot on the side of his face. "What did you do?" he asked, amazed. "Exactly what I thought you wanted. Look, we can fix this. Sit down, have a drink, and I'll take care of everything." "I don't think so," said Sean, his hand still absently fondling his bald spot. "We know how to cut hair," said Eric. "Really?" asked Sean, a bit desperate now. "Yeah, we can do it, but it'll be shorter to match the first cut." "Do whatever you have to do," he said, sitting back down. "Oh, so you're just going to chicken out at the first sign of trouble?" asked Royal incredulously. "Yeah, I'm just going to chicken out. I'm a total coward when it comes to you and my hair. Give them the scissors." "I'm not holding any candle," he said defiantly, slamming the scissors on the table. "Good," said Sean. "I don't even trust you with that." So everyone switched places, Royal sitting in the corner and sulking, the twins manning the scissors, and Patrick and I on candle detail. Karsten, seated on my right, feeling a bit left out, started going on about how the new Euro style was called burning. It involved using a lighter and catching the edge of your hair on fire, and then immediately putting it back out. Actually, singeing would have been more accurate if a little less colorful. The effect was that the hair would be a little shorter and curled. There were salons in Munich and Paris that could style your hair entirely without ever using a blade, he told us. Entranced with his own story, he produced the lighter from his pocket and pronounced, "Let me show you." I looked up in amazement as he caught a lock of hair hanging above his right eye on fire and then slapped his forehead, putting it out a split second later. I held my candle close to his face, and we all surveyed his handiwork. "Well, I'll be damned," said Patrick. The burn area was shorter and curled tighter than any of its neighbors. "It works," I said, pulling the candle back. "Yeah, as I told you, the latest in European fashion," said Karsten, very excited, very drunk. "Keep the edge of your eye on me," he added, lighting and slapping again. I looked around the room and realized we'd descended into some kind of backwoods squatter bedlam. Royal was playing air guitar to Led Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy off a distorted tape player in the corner, while outside the rain hammered the roof like 1,000 nails falling on a marble floor. Patrick and I were holding dripping candles next to my friend's head so that his identity makeover could be corrected, and the guy next to me, who I just met a few hours before, had me on standby in case the burning got out of hand. Oh, and there was the drinking. By this point, I twisted the candle to catch a glance at my watch, 2:30 a.m. We were trashed. I counted backward, realizing that all of us had been awake at least 24 hours, maybe longer, my head buzzing too loud to continue the calculations. "What about this?" yelled Royal over the music and the rain, bending the imaginary neck of his guitar as Jimmy Page raced through the scales in the title track. I heard the scratch of flint next to me and momentarily saw blue tendrils snaking up their way towards the top of Karsten's head. Bam! went his hand, extinguishing the embryonic flames, a faint whiff of burnt air drifting my way. John's eyes were partially closed as he stared across the room at nothing in a sleep-deprived, drunken twilight. The twins were chattering away, strategizing, comparing notes, and as I listened closer, I could swear every third word was some foreign substitute from a language only they understood. I shook my head and opened my eyes wide, trying to clear it. Just then, they said another nonsense phrase and burst into high-pitched laughter. I was lightheaded, untethered. The room seemed to tilt a bit, and the sound of the rain grew louder, drowning out the other noises. Something flickered on the edge of my vision, dancing in ghostly blue light. In the corner of my eye, I could see Karsten laughing at something Eric and Arthur had said, nodding his head in agreement. The lighter was in his right hand, on the table in front of him. Across the top of his sandy brown hair danced pale blue shadows of flame. It was barely a fire at all, I thought, watching it race across the tips of his hair, which receded and crackled in slow-moving series of V waves. The acrid smell slapped me on my trance as I yelled, "Karsten!" upending my nearly full beer and pouring it over his head. It put out the fire, and Karsten leapt off the bench, sputtering and cursing in German, like a cat that had fallen in a bathtub. There was beer all over his shoulders and down the front of his sweater, and his hair, amazingly intact, was stuck to his head in a hoppy, sudsy mess. "What is this craziness?" he yelled, rediscovering his English. I was laughing, trying to regain my composure, while everyone else just stared at me, the crazy man had attacked poor Karsten without provocation or warning. I shook my head and held up a hand in defense, while I came to my senses, wiping tears from the corners of my eyes. "His hair," I said, starting to laugh again. "Ja, my hair," said Karsten. "You have wetted me wrongly," he exclaimed, which didn't help my attempts to get serious. Finally, I got together and said, "Your hair was on fire." And then everybody got it, and I was a hero for a couple of minutes. And we'll leave it there.
That is wonderful in a self-destructive sort of way.
That all happened too. Those little parts of it are like very fictionalized, and but that's actually like pretty close to.
I'm surprised also that you remembered so many details.
Yeah, I don't know. Like certain things get kind of burned into your head, right?
Or on your head.
Yeah. I don't remember that out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting there and he was like laughing and looking at it, and I was looking. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's what it looks like when you're hearing something. Like I'm thinking about it. All of a sudden, I'm like, you're on fire.
Have you stayed in touch?
Karsten, no, he's off the grid. Patrick, no. The twins, I'm still friends with the twins, and we met up there in Alaska, and Sean and Dave Royal and I, and they're like they came down and went to one of these dead shows just a couple months ago at the Hollywood Bowl, and whenever I'm up in San Francisco, I visit them up there. So yeah, we're all still friends.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Not
Thank you.
only learning how to pronounce your name in two languages, but hearing the story that you printed and the stories that didn't make the final cut, but were entertaining
Yeah.
nonetheless. This has been a lot of fun, and thanks for sharing with us. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
That was my August 2023 interview with Dave Bueche, reading from his recent novel, Tales from Hippie Cove. If you have questions or comments for Dave you'd like me to pass along, email me at djng@earthlink.net. If you are an author who has something you'd like to share with the world at large, contact me at djng@earthlink.net. That's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.